Welcome back to Mr. Cursed. I need to warn you about something. 6 people went looking for old forgotten places in the Appalachian Mountains. What they found was impossible, places that shouldn't exist anymore, but do, and worse. Something lives in them now, something that's been waiting decades for visitors. I'm not talking about ghosts or legends, I'm talking about real locations where real people walked in and barely made it out. Some didn't make it out at all. Before we start, smash that subscribe button because you'll want to follow what happens next. Hit like and comment where you're watching from. Now turn off the lights because story number 1 will change how you see those mountains forever. Here we go. My name's Jake Morrison and I'm 29 years old. I work as a freelance photographer, mostly doing nature shoots and magazine work, but what really pays the bills is documenting abandoned places for historical preservation societies. There's something about forgotten locations that draws me in. The way nature slowly reclaims what humans built, the stories hidden in decay. I've been doing this for about 6 years now, ever since I got out of college, and I thought I'd seen everything these mountains had to offer. I was wrong. It started with a commission from the West Virginia Historical Society. They'd received a tip about an intact company town somewhere in the remote Appalachian backcountry, supposedly untouched since the mine closed in the 1970s. The caller had been anonymous, but they'd provided GPS coordinates and claimed there were buildings, equipment, even personal belongings left exactly as they were when the last residents fled. Company towns weren't unusual in West Virginia. Coal companies used to build entire communities around their operations, complete with housing, stores, schools, even churches. When the coal played out or became unprofitable to extract, they'd simply abandon everything. Most of these places had been demolished or stripped for salvage decades ago, but every now and then you'd find one that time forgot. The coordinates led me deep into the mountains of Pocahontas County, following increasingly narrow dirt roads that my GPS insisted were highways. I'm used to driving into remote areas for shoots, but this felt different somehow. The forest seemed denser here, older. The trees pressed in close to the road, their branches forming a canopy so thick that it blocked out most of the afternoon sun. I'd been driving for about 3 hours when I started noticing the silence. At first I thought it was just the usual quiet you get in deep wilderness, but as I paid more attention I realized it was something else entirely. No bird songs, no insect buzz, no wind through the trees. Even my truck's engine seemed muffled, like the sound was being absorbed by something unseen. The road dead-ended at a rusted metal gate with a faded sign, Millfield Coal Company, authorized personnel only. The chain that had once secured the gate was broken, hanging loose like it had been cut recently. Beyond the gate, the road continued down into a valley that was hidden from view by the surrounding hills. I parked and grabbed my camera gear. The Historical Society was paying me well for this shoot, and even if the town turned out to be a bust, I could probably get some decent landscape shots of the area. I've learned to always have a backup plan when you're this far from civilization. The walk down into the valley took about 20 minutes, following what had once been a paved road, but was now mostly gravel and weeds. As I crested a small rise, I got my first view of Millfield, and I had to stop and stare. It was, perfect. Not preserved, perfect. Like the residents had stepped out for lunch and forgotten to come back. Houses lined both sides of the main street, their windows intact, their porches still sporting furniture and potted plants. Gardens grew wild but recognizable behind white picket fences. Clotheslines stretched between buildings, still holding faded garments that swayed in a breeze I couldn't feel. At the center of town stood the company store, a large wooden building that dominated the main square. Its windows glowed with warm yellow light, despite the fact that the power lines running into town were obviously long dead, their poles leaning at crazy angles and their wires draped uselessly in the trees. I started taking pictures immediately. This was better than anything I'd hoped for, a completely intact slice of 1970s Americana, frozen in time. The Historical Society would be thrilled, and I was already planning the magazine articles I could pitch: America's Forgotten Company Town, or Time Stands Still in Appalachian Valley. I worked my way down the main street, documenting everything, the barbershop with its striped pole still spinning slowly in the window, the post office with mail scattered across the counter as if the postmaster had been interrupted mid-sort, the small church with its bell tower reaching toward the canopy of trees that had grown up around the town. What struck me most was how lived-in everything looked. Dishes sat on kitchen tables visible through windows. Newspapers lay folded on front porches, their headlines talking about Nixon and Vietnam. Children's toys were scattered in yards as if kids had been called in for dinner and would be back out to play tomorrow. But I didn't see any actual people. I called out a few times, "Hello, anyone here?" But my voice seemed to die in the thick air, absorbed and muffled like everything else. The silence that followed felt almost aggressive, like the town itself was holding its breath. It was when I reached the company store that things started to feel wrong. The front door stood slightly ajar, and that warm yellow light spilled out across the wooden sidewalk. Through the windows I could see fully stocked shelves, a cash register that looked like it was from the early 70s, and what appeared to be fresh produce in bins near the front counter. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. A brass bell above the door should have chimed, but it made no sound. The air inside was thick and warm, with a sweet smell that reminded me of overripe fruit and old flowers. The store was immaculate. Every shelf was perfectly arranged, every product facing forward like a grocery store manager's dream. The produce looked fresh: apples with no brown spots, bananas that were perfectly yellow, lettuce that was still crisp and green. But when I reached out to touch one of the apples, my hand passed right through it. I jerked back so fast I knocked over a display of canned goods, or I should have. The cans didn't move, didn't make any sound. They just sat there, solid and unmovable, while my hands passed through them like they were made of smoke. I stumbled backward toward the door, my camera forgotten, trying to understand what I was seeing. Everything in the store looked real, but I couldn't touch any of it. It was like looking at a three-dimensional photograph, perfectly detailed, but completely insubstantial. That's when I heard the voices. They were coming from deeper in the store, near what looked like a small office area in the back. Conversations, but too muted to make out words. The sound of cash register keys being pressed, the rustle of paper bags, normal store sounds, except they were coming from a place where nothing was actually real. I moved toward the back of the store, my footsteps echoing strangely in the thick air. The voices got clearer as I approached, and I began to make out individual words. Need to charge it to my account. Haven't seen him since the accident. Company says we have to stay until... I reached the office area and saw them. Dozens of people, maybe the entire population of the town, standing in lines that led to a counter, where a man in a white shirt and tie was apparently serving customers. They were translucent, like old film negative, but I could make out their faces, their clothes, their expressions. They were terrified. Every face showed the same desperate fear, the same trapped animal look of people who knew something terrible was happening, but couldn't escape it. Some were holding children who clung to their parents with wide, frightened eyes. Others clutched papers that might have been bills or legal documents, shaking hands, making the pages flutter. The man behind the counter was different. He was solid, opaque, real in a way that the others weren't. He was writing in a large ledger book, making entries with a fountain pen that scratched across the pages with the sound of fingernails on a chalkboard. Each time he made an entry, one of the translucent figures would cry out in anguish, a sound like wind through a broken window. When he looked up and saw me standing there, he smiled. "You must be the new photographer," he said, his voice warm and friendly. "We've been expecting you. I'm Robert Hartley, store manager. Welcome to Millfield." I tried to run. I turned and bolted for the door, but the store had changed. The aisles stretched impossibly long in front of me, disappearing into a darkness that my eyes couldn't penetrate. The yellow light that had seemed so warm now felt sickly and wrong, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. Behind me, I could hear Hartley's footsteps, measured and unhurried. "Don't be afraid," he called out. "We just need to get you set up with an account. Everyone who visits Millfield needs an account." I reached what should have been the front door, but it was now just another aisle of shelves. I spun around looking for any exit and saw Hartley approaching with his ledger book and fountain pen. The translucent figures had followed us, forming a circle around me like spectators at an execution. "The town has been waiting for someone new," Hartley explained conversationally. "The last photographer was some time ago, the 1970s, I believe. Nice young man from the county paper. He documented everything beautifully before he joined our permanent collection." That's when I understood. The town wasn't abandoned, it was a trap, something that fed on visitors, adding them to its population of the trapped and desperate. The people I was seeing weren't ghosts. They were prisoners, bound to this place by whatever debt or obligation Hartley wrote in his book. I fumbled for my camera, thinking maybe if I could document what was happening, somehow get evidence. But when I raised it to take a photo, I saw through the viewfinder that I was becoming translucent myself. My hands were fading, becoming see-through like the other prisoners. "Just a simple signature," Hartley said, offering me the fountain pen. "Everyone who visits Millfield eventually needs to sign. The terms are very reasonable: full room and board, steady work, community support. The only requirement is that you can never leave." I threw the camera at him and ran in a direction I hoped was toward an exit. Behind me, I heard him laugh, a sound like grinding coal. "The town will help you find your way," he called after me. "Millfield takes care of its residents." The store seemed to shift and change around me as I ran. Aisles became corridors, corridors became rooms, rooms became aisles. The other prisoners reached out as I passed, their translucent fingers grasping at my clothes, their mouths moving in silent pleas for help. I don't know how long I ran through that impossible space, but eventually I saw real daylight ahead. Not the sick, yellow glow of the store's lights, but genuine sunshine filtering through trees. I burst through what might have been a door or might have been a window and found myself back on the main street of Millfield. But the town had changed. The houses were now obviously decayed and abandoned, their windows broken, their porches collapsed. Vines had grown over everything, and the trees had pushed up through the streets and sidewalks. It looked like what an abandoned company town should look like after 40 years of neglect. I ran toward where I'd left my truck, not looking back, not stopping to see if Hartley or the other prisoners were following. The walk that had taken 20 minutes on the way in seemed to take hours on the way out, but eventually I reached the rusted gate and my vehicle. I drove for 2 hours before I stopped shaking enough to pull over and check the photos on my camera. There were only 3 images on the memory card, all of them showing normal forest scenes from my drive up the mountain. No town, no buildings, no evidence that Millfield had ever existed. But when I checked my wallet, I found a business card I'd never seen before, cream-colored cardstock with elegant script, Millfield Company Store, R. Hartley, manager, serving the community, since 1892. On the back, in handwriting that matched the fountain pen scratches I'd heard in the store, was a message: account opened pending signature. Please return at your earliest convenience to complete enrollment. I've never gone back to those coordinates. I threw away the business card, but it keeps reappearing in my camera bag, my glove compartment, my jacket pockets. Sometimes I find it slipped under my apartment door in the morning, always with a new handwritten message on the back. Millfield misses you. Your account requires attention. The community would like you to visit soon. I've stopped doing abandoned place photography. I can't risk finding another place like Millfield, another trap disguised as a forgotten piece of history. Because I know now that some places aren't abandoned at all. They're just waiting, patient and hungry, for the next person curious enough to step inside their perfectly preserved jaws. And I know that eventually Hartley's going to get tired of sending cards and come looking for me himself. My name's Carlos, and I'm 28 years old. I've been working as an auto mechanic for about 6 years now, mostly at this shop in Charleston, West Virginia. It's honest work, but the pay isn't great, so I've been picking up side jobs on weekends, buying broken down cars and trucks, fixing them up, and flipping them for whatever profit I can squeeze out. My dad taught me everything I know about engines when I was a kid, and I guess I've got a good eye for what's worth saving and what's just scrap metal. I was scrolling through Craigslist one Saturday morning in late October when I saw this ad that caught my attention. Someone was selling old logging equipment way up in the mountains, about 3 hours north of where I live. The price seemed too good to be true. The guy was asking almost nothing for what he described as vintage sawmill machinery, some still operational. I figured even if most of it was junk, there had to be some valuable parts I could salvage. Steel, hydraulics, maybe some decent engines I could rebuild. I called the number and this old guy answered. Sounded like he just wanted the stuff gone. He gave me directions to some place called Devil's Creek, said I could take whatever I wanted as long as I hauled it away myself. The drive up into those mountains was something else. I'd lived in West Virginia my whole life, but I'd never been that far into the backcountry. The roads got narrower and more twisted the higher I went, and after the first hour I stopped seeing any houses or even power lines. Just thick forest on both sides, mostly oak and maple trees with their leaves turning all these brilliant reds and golds. My truck was handling the steep grades okay, but I was starting to wonder if I'd bitten off more than I could chew when the GPS on my phone finally lost signal completely. I had to navigate by the handwritten directions the old man had given me, looking for landmarks like the dead oak that looks like a fork and the creek crossing with the rusted guardrail. It felt like I was driving back in time, away from everything modern and civilized. The air got thinner and colder as I climbed, and I could smell that crisp mountain autumn scent, rotting leaves mixed with pine, and that clean, sharp smell you only get at elevation. When I finally found the turnoff to Devil's Creek, it wasn't much more than 2 tire ruts disappearing into the woods. The mailbox at the entrance was so rusted and shot full of holes, I couldn't even make out what it might have said originally. I followed the track for maybe half a mile, branches scraping against my truck windows, until the path opened up into this narrow valley I hadn't expected. That's when I saw the lumber mill. I'd been expecting maybe a few pieces of old equipment scattered around a clearing, the kind of thing you'd find at any abandoned work site. But this was something completely different. It was a whole complex, massive sawmill buildings, worker housing, equipment yards, even what looked like a company store. Everything was still standing, like whoever worked there had just walked away one day and never came back. What really struck me was how well preserved everything looked. I'd worked on enough old machinery to know what 50 years of weather and rust can do to metal, but this stuff looked almost new. The corrugated steel buildings weren't even that faded, and when I got out of my truck and walked over to examine some of the equipment, I could see that the hydraulic lines were still intact, the engine blocks weren't seized up, and there wasn't a speck of rust on any of the moving parts. I spent the rest of that afternoon just walking around, taking inventory. There were at least 3 massive sawmill engines, probably worth a few thousand each even as scrap. Conveyor systems that looked like they'd start right up if you hooked them to power. Hydraulic lifts, winches, cutting equipment, easily $20,000 or $30,000 worth of salvageable parts if I could figure out how to get them down the mountain. The strangest thing was how quiet it was. I mean, I expected quiet. We were miles from any road or town. But this was different. No birds singing, no insects buzzing, not even any wind moving through the trees. Just this heavy, thick silence that seemed to press down on everything. I kept stopping what I was doing to listen, thinking I'd heard something, but it was always just more of that same dead quiet. As the sun started getting low, I decided to set up camp for the night. I'd brought a tent and sleeping bag, figuring I'd get an early start in the morning and spend the whole next day figuring out what I could realistically haul out of there. I found a level spot near what looked like the old foreman's office and got my campsite set up while there was still light. I remember feeling pretty good that evening, sitting by my little camp stove, eating beans out of a can and planning out which pieces I'd tackle first. This was exactly the kind of score I'd been hoping to find. Enough valuable salvage to pay my rent for the next 6 months if I played it right. I fell asleep thinking about hydraulic pumps and steel prices. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night to that same absolute silence I'd noticed earlier, except now it felt wrong in a way I couldn't put my finger on. The air in my tent felt thick and heavy, like breathing through a wet blanket. When I unzipped the tent flap to get some fresh air, that's when I saw them. 3 perfect stacks of stones, each about waist high, arranged in a triangle around the mill complex. They hadn't been there when I'd set up camp, I was sure of that. These weren't just random piles of rocks either. They were perfectly balanced, each stone fitted precisely on top of the others, like someone had spent hours getting them just right. What made my skin crawl was what was sitting on top of each pile. One had my wrench set, the good craftsman set my dad had given me for my 18th birthday. Another had my phone charger. The third had my truck keys. I hadn't touched any of that stuff since I'd set up camp. It had all been in my truck or in my toolbox. But there it was, sitting on top of these stone cairns that definitely hadn't existed 6 hours earlier. I grabbed a flashlight and walked over to the nearest pile, my heart pounding. When I picked up my keys, they were ice cold, like they'd been sitting in a freezer. The stones underneath were cold too, but not just from the night air. This was a deeper cold, the kind that seems to come from inside the rock itself. That's when I noticed the smell. Sharp and metallic, like blood mixed with motor oil, but underneath it was something organic and rotten. It was coming from the forest around the mill, getting stronger as a breeze finally started moving through the trees. I saw the red cloth strips when my flashlight beam swept across the tree line. Bright red fabric, almost like surveyor's tape, tied to branches at regular intervals all around the perimeter of the mill complex. I was pretty sure those hadn't been there either, but in the dark it was hard to tell where they started or ended. I didn't sleep much the rest of that night. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something moving around outside. Not footsteps exactly, but this soft scraping sound like something being dragged across the ground. And twice, I could have sworn I heard my own voice calling my name from somewhere out in the woods. When morning finally came, I was ready to pack up and get out of there, salvage operation or no salvage operation. But when I went to load my gear back into the truck, I found muddy handprints all over the hood and doors. They looked human at first glance, but when I looked closer, they only had 4 fingers each, and the palms were facing the wrong direction, like whatever made them had its hands on backwards. I was loading the last of my camping gear when the sawmill started up. It was just after midnight when I heard the first engine turn over, this deep, throaty rumble that I recognized immediately as a big diesel starting up after sitting cold. Then another engine joined it, and another, until the whole valley was echoing with the sound of heavy machinery coming to life. The thing was, I could see the mill from my campsite and there was nobody there. No lights, no workers, nothing. But I could hear conveyor belts starting to move, the whine of saw blades spinning up to speed, the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of lumber being processed through the line. It ran for about 2 hours. I sat in my tent with my flashlight, listening to this phantom lumber operation, processing timber that wasn't there, cutting boards from logs that didn't exist. The sounds were so real, so familiar from construction sites I'd worked near, that part of my brain kept insisting there had to be an explanation. Maybe the machinery was automated somehow, or maybe there were workers there I just couldn't see in the dark. But when the sun came up and everything went quiet again, I walked over to check the mill equipment. None of it had moved. The conveyor belts were in the exact same position as the day before. The saw blades were clean, with no sawdust or wood chips anywhere. Even the engine blocks were cold to the touch. That's when I really started paying attention to the forest around the mill. The trees closest to the complex were wrong. Their bark was turning black in patches, weeping this dark, sticky sap that smelled like the metallic odor I'd noticed the night before. Lower branches were withering even though it was still weeks before the leaves should have been dropping, and the undergrowth was dying back in a perfect circle around the mill buildings. I found more of those 4-fingered handprints on the equipment, and when I followed them, they led to a trail that disappeared into the darkest part of the forest. The red cloth markers were tied to trees all along this trail, like breadcrumbs leading deeper into the woods. I should have left then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to pack up and drive away, but I kept thinking about all that valuable equipment and how I'd come all this way, and how much money I stood to lose if I chickened out over some weird coincidences and creepy forest sounds. But that was my first mistake. I spent the day trying to work, focusing on the smaller pieces I could load by myself. But every time I got absorbed in what I was doing, I'd get this feeling like someone was watching me. I'd look up toward the tree line and catch glimpses of something pale moving between the trees. Tall and thin, too thin to be human, with arms that hung down too far and joints that bent the wrong way. Whenever I looked directly at it, there was nothing there. But in my peripheral vision, I could see it watching me, studying the way I moved around the equipment, learning my patterns. The voice started that afternoon. At first, it sounded like someone calling from far away, maybe a hiker or hunter who'd gotten lost. But as it got closer, I realized it was my own name, spoken in my own voice. Perfect mimicry, like a recording of myself calling out, "Carlos, Carlos, Carlos." Always from a different direction. Always just close enough that I'd think someone was right there behind me. I'd turn around, and there'd be nothing but trees and shadows and those damned red cloth strips fluttering in the breeze. By evening, I'd managed to load a few hydraulic pumps and some smaller engine components into my truck bed, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. The forest felt hostile now, like the trees themselves were leaning in toward the mill, trying to reclaim it. The smell was getting stronger too, that mixture of metal and rot that seemed to be seeping up out of the ground. I was securing the load with bungee cords when I heard footsteps in the gravel behind me. Not the soft scraping I'd been hearing all day, but actual human footsteps. I spun around, relieved to finally see another person, but there was nobody there. The footsteps continued, circling around me, crunching in the gravel and dried leaves. I could hear them clearly, could even tell by the sound that whoever was making them was wearing work boots, but I couldn't see anything. That's when I finally understood what I was dealing with. This wasn't just some abandoned lumber mill. Something had happened here, something bad enough that it left a mark on the place itself. And whatever was left behind didn't want me taking its equipment. I spent that second night in my truck instead of the tent, doors locked, engine running, ready to drive out of there at the first sign of trouble. But the thing in the woods wasn't done with me yet. Around 3 a.m., something started tapping on the windows, slow, deliberate, like someone knocking politely to get my attention. When I shined my flashlight through the glass, I could see the prints being left behind, those same four-fingered handprints, but now I could see that the fingers were too long, with too many joints, ending in what looked like claws. The tapping moved around the truck methodically, testing each window, each door. Whatever was out there was smart enough to check for weaknesses, patient enough to take its time. And it was learning. Each time it came back to a window, the tapping was more insistent, more aggressive. I tried to start the engine and drive away, but the truck wouldn't turn over. The engine would crank, but never catch, like something was preventing the fuel from reaching the cylinders. I'd been working on cars long enough to know that sound, and I knew my truck had been running fine just a few hours earlier. By dawn, the tapping had stopped, but when I finally got out of the truck, I found that every piece of equipment I'd loaded into the bed was gone, not stolen, gone, like it had never been there at all. Even the bungee cords I'd used to tie everything down had vanished. That's when I saw it clearly for the first time. It was standing at the edge of the forest, maybe 50 yards away, and it was definitely not human. Tall, probably 8 feet, with grey skin that looked like wet concrete. Its arms hung down almost to its knees, and they bent in places where arms shouldn't bend. The face was the worst part. Mostly human, but wrong in subtle ways that made my brain hurt to look at. Like someone had tried to make a person from memory and gotten a few details catastrophically wrong. We stared at each other for what felt like an hour, but was probably only a few seconds. Then it turned and walked back into the forest, moving with this fluid, boneless motion that reminded me of a snake more than anything with legs. I understood then that this thing, whatever it was, had been connected to this place for a long time. Longer than the lumber mill, longer than the loggers who'd worked here. It had watched them come and cut down its forest, poison its streams, destroy its territory. And when they'd finally abandoned the mill in 1967, it had claimed the place as a monument to what they'd done. The mill wasn't just abandoned, it was being preserved, maintained, kept exactly as it had been the day the last logger walked away, as a reminder of the violation that had been committed here. And it had been collecting anyone who tried to disturb that monument. I finally managed to get my truck started around noon, after I'd apologized to empty air and promised not to take anything. The engine turned over on the first try like it had never had any problems at all. But as I drove away, I could see that pale figure in my rearview mirror, standing in the middle of the road, watching me leave. I called the county sheriff when I got back to civilization, told them about the mill and the environmental damage I'd seen. They sent some people up to investigate, and what they found was a toxic waste site. Decades of industrial chemicals had leached into the soil and groundwater, creating exactly the kind of ecological disaster that takes generations to clean up. The mill complex was condemned and declared a hazardous waste site. The access road was gated off and warning signs were posted everywhere. As far as I know, it's still up there, slowly being reclaimed by the forest that's finally healing from what was done to it. I never went back. I couldn't even drive on mountain roads for months without feeling like something was watching me from the tree line. I ended up changing careers entirely, got certified in environmental remediation, and now I work cleaning up industrial pollution sites. Maybe it's my way of making amends, or maybe it's just that I understand now how much damage we can do to places that were never meant to be disturbed. But sometimes, when I'm working at a site deep in the woods, I still get that feeling like something old and patient is watching from the shadows, remembering what was taken from it, deciding whether or not I deserve to leave. I always make sure to finish my work quickly and get out before dark. My name's Dave, and I was 29 when I discovered something in the North Carolina mountains that still haunts my dreams. Back then, I was just another construction worker who got laid off when the housing market crashed. I'd been doing residential work around Charlotte for 6 years, good, steady money. Until suddenly I'm staring at unemployment forms, wondering how I'm going to survive. My girlfriend Sarah kept saying it would blow over, but I could see projects getting cancelled everywhere. Nobody was building houses when people couldn't sell the ones they had. So I started looking for work in the mountains of western North Carolina. Rural logging operations, forestry jobs, anything that could use a guy with heavy equipment experience. I figured my construction background had to count for something. Plus, I was getting desperate. Unemployment wasn't going to cover my bills, and I wasn't about to move back in with my parents. The mountains up there are different from anything you'd expect. You drive these winding roads that climb forever, through valleys where the trees are so thick you can barely see sky. I'd grown up in suburbs, so all that wilderness felt beautiful but also intimidating. You realize how alone you are when you're surrounded by forest that stretches to every horizon. I spent a week staying in cheap motels, asking at lumber mills if they needed workers. Most places weren't hiring or wanted guys with specific logging experience. I was ready to give up when this old-timer at a diner in Burnsville mentioned crews working deeper in the mountains, in places you had to know the old logging roads to find. That got my attention. Remote operations usually paid better, and I was running out of options. The guy gave me rough directions to a logging road off Highway 80, said if I followed it far enough, I'd find work. He seemed hesitant to talk about it, kept glancing around like he was worried someone might overhear. Sarah wasn't happy about me going deeper into the mountains. We talked every night, and she kept saying I should come home and figure out something else. But what else was I going to do? Stock shelves for minimum wage? I had real skills, and I wasn't ready to give up on using them. The next morning, I loaded supplies for several days and headed out. The logging road was easy to find, but once I turned onto it, I realized I was getting into serious wilderness. Single-lane dirt that wound through forests so dense it felt like driving through a tunnel. Some of those trees had to be hundreds of years old, massive trunks that would take 4 people holding hands to circle. I drove for over an hour, following the road as it climbed higher into mountains I couldn't even see through the canopy. The deeper I went, the older everything looked. These weren't managed forests or tree farms. This was primeval woodland, the kind that had been growing since before Europeans arrived. Just when I was starting to think I'd taken a wrong turn, I heard machinery ahead, chainsaws, diesel engines, heavy equipment. I followed the sound, and the road opened into a clearing where a full logging operation was running. But something felt wrong immediately. The camp was huge, way bigger than anything that should exist this far from civilization. Trucks everywhere, a sawmill running at full capacity, Crews working massive old-growth trees at the clearing's edge, but it was too quiet for the scale of operation. Not enough voices, not enough radio chatter, just the mechanical sounds of equipment and the crash of falling trees. I parked near what looked like a main office and walked over. A man came out before I reached the door, like he'd been watching me approach. He was maybe 50, wearing clean work clothes that seemed wrong for a logging camp. Too new? Too pressed? "You lost?" he asked. His voice was pleasant enough, but his eyes were cold. I explained I was looking for work, mentioned my construction background. His whole demeanor shifted when I talked about operating heavy equipment. He introduced himself as Bill Morrison, site supervisor, and said they'd just lost some workers and needed someone with my skills. The pay he quoted was almost double what I'd made in construction, plus room and board. It seemed too good to be true, but I needed the work. He showed me around the operation, introduced me to some crew members, and by afternoon, I was operating a bulldozer. That first day, I was just grateful to have steady work again. The crew seemed professional, the equipment was well maintained, and the bunkhouse was clean with decent food. I called Sarah that night and told her I'd found something good, that I'd probably stay a few months to save money. But it didn't take long to notice things that bothered me. The first weird thing was the work schedule. We operated around the clock with crews running day and night shifts. Bill said they had quotas to meet, contracts with tight deadlines. But I'd never seen a logging operation that ran 24/7 like that. It seemed excessive, almost frantic. The second thing was the trees we were cutting. These weren't normal commercial timber. Every tree was massive, ancient, irreplaceable. Some had trunks 6 feet across, canopies that disappeared into mist. When they fell, the sound was like thunder, and the ground shook under my feet. It felt like witnessing something sacred being destroyed. But what really got to me was the wildlife situation. When we first cleared an area, animals were everywhere. Deer, bears, countless birds. But as we expanded the operation, they didn't just move away. They disappeared completely. No tracks, no signs, nothing. Like they'd vanished into thin air. Then I started noticing the other workers more carefully. Most of the crew were locals, mountain people who'd been doing this work for generations. But they moved differently than any loggers I'd known. Too synchronized, too focused. They rarely talked during breaks, rarely looked directly at each other. When they did speak, it was always about the work, never personal conversation. And they worked with an intensity that seemed unnatural. I'd watch a crew with chainsaws attack a massive oak, and they'd cut with perfect precision, never needing to communicate about angles or timing. Like they shared some kind of collective instinct. The night shift was even stranger. I usually worked days, but one evening, Bill asked me to stay late to help move equipment. As darkness fell, I saw the night crew emerging from the bunkhouses. They moved through the forest like they could see in complete darkness, never using flashlights, never stumbling over roots or rocks. I mentioned it to Jake, one of the day shift workers who seemed more normal than the others. His response chilled me. "Night crew's been here longer?" he said quietly, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard. "Some of them been here since the operation started?" "When did it start?" I asked. Jake looked uncomfortable. "Nobody talks about that, but some of these guys..." He shook his head. "Some of these guys look exactly the same as when I started 5 years ago." That conversation planted a seed of unease that grew stronger every day. I started paying closer attention to the workers, and Jake was right. Some of them looked ageless, like they'd been frozen in time. Their faces never showed fatigue, their bodies never seemed to wear down, even after 12-hour shifts operating heavy machinery. I also started noticing that we never had inspectors visit. No forestry service, no environmental oversight, no safety compliance checks. For an operation this size in what had to be protected wilderness, that seemed impossible. One evening, I decided to explore beyond the work areas. I told Bill I was going for a hike to clear my head, and he gave me a strange look, but didn't object. I followed one of the access roads deeper into the forest, beyond where our crews had been cutting. What I found made my blood run cold. There were other clearings, older ones, where massive stumps showed evidence of logging that had happened decades ago, but the stumps weren't weathered like they should be. They looked fresh, like they'd been cut recently. And scattered among them were pieces of equipment I didn't recognize. Machinery that looked like it came from the 1950s or earlier, but showed no signs of rust or decay. In one clearing, I found something that made me run back to camp. It was a graveyard. Not marked graves with headstones, but dozens of mounds in neat rows, each about the size of a human body. Fresh dirt, like they'd been dug recently. Some had pieces of clothing sticking out. Work clothes, hard hats, logging boots. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about those graves, about the ageless workers, about the operation that ran constantly in forest that should have been protected. I started wondering if the men I worked with every day were actually alive. The next morning, I decided to test my theory. During break, I struck up a conversation with Tom, one of the chainsaw operators who'd supposedly been there since the camp started. I asked him about his family, where he'd grown up, normal getting-to-know-you questions. His answers were wrong. Not lies exactly, but responses that didn't quite make sense. He mentioned growing up in towns that had been abandoned for decades, talked about working for lumber companies that had gone out of business in the 1960s. When I asked for specifics, his eyes would go blank for a moment, like he was trying to remember something that wasn't quite there. That afternoon, I made an excuse about feeling sick and went back to the bunkhouse early. I used my phone to try researching the area, looking for information about the land we were working. What I found terrified me. According to every map and database I could access, there was no active logging operation in this area. The entire region was designated as protected wilderness, off-limits to commercial development for over 30 years. More disturbing, I found historical records of logging camps that had operated in these mountains in the early 1900s, camps where workers had died in accidents or simply disappeared. I found newspaper articles from the 1940s about a logging operation that had vanished overnight, leaving behind only empty bunkhouses and equipment. Search parties had found evidence of a large camp, but no trace of the workers who'd been living there. The company that owned the operation denied ever having crews in that area. There were other stories too. Hikers and hunters who'd reported seeing lights and hearing machinery deep in protected forest areas. Forest Service rangers who'd investigated and found nothing but old growth trees and wildlife. But the reports kept coming, decade after decade, always describing the same thing: active logging operations in places where no logging was supposed to happen. I was reading these articles when Bill knocked on my bunkhouse door. He came in without waiting for permission, and I quickly closed my phone. "Feeling better?" he asked, but his tone suggested he didn't really care about my health. "Yeah, just needed some rest," I said. Bill sat down on the bed across from mine, studying my face with those cold eyes. "You know, Dave, we don't get many outsiders here. Most of our crew comes from local families, people who understand the work we do." There was something threatening in his voice, though his words seemed innocent enough. "This is good work," he continued. "Steady work, the kind of job a man could do for a very long time, forever even." The way he said forever made my skin crawl. "Some of our best workers have been here so long they've become part of the operation. part of the forest itself. They don't worry about the outside world anymore, don't need to. I forced myself to nod and smile. I appreciate the opportunity. This is exactly what I was looking for. Bill smiled back, but it didn't reach his eyes. Good, I'm glad you're fitting in. Just remember, what happens in these mountains stays in these mountains. Some places are meant to be forgotten by the outside world. After he left, I sat there, shaking. The message was clear enough. Workers who came here didn't leave. They became part of whatever this operation really was. That night, I made my plan to escape. I couldn't just walk away. Bill would notice immediately, and I had no idea how far I was from the main road. Instead, I decided to fake another equipment breakdown that would require me to drive out for parts. It was a thin excuse, but it might buy me enough time to reach civilization. The next morning, I sabotaged one of the bulldozers I'd been operating, making it look like a hydraulic failure that would require specialized parts. I reported it to Bill, who seemed annoyed but agreed that someone would need to drive to Asheville for replacement components. "Take Jake with you," Bill said. "He knows where to get what we need." My heart sank. Jake was one of the workers I'd thought seemed more normal, but if Bill was sending him with me, he was probably part of whatever was happening here. We loaded into my truck early that morning, with Jake giving directions back toward the main road. For the first hour, he seemed like the same guy I'd been working with, making casual conversation, complaining about the early start. But the farther we got from the camp, the more agitated he became. "Maybe we should turn around," he said, when we were halfway back to the highway. "Bill might need us back at camp." "We'll be quick," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Just grab the parts and head back." Jake was quiet for a while, but I could see him getting more uncomfortable. His hands were shaking, and he kept looking back toward the mountains like something was pulling at him. "Dave," he said finally, his voice strained, "I need to tell you something. About the camp. About what we're really doing there." I gripped the steering wheel tighter. "What do you mean?" "The operation. It's not what Bill told you. We're not just cutting timber." Jake's voice was getting weaker, like he was fighting to get the words out. "We're feeding something that lives in those mountains, something old." "Jake, what are you talking about?" "The forest," he whispered. "It's alive. It's hungry. The trees we cut, they're not really trees. They're part of something bigger, something that's been growing for thousands of years. And when we cut them, it feeds on us instead." I looked at Jake and saw that his skin was changing, becoming bark-like, rough and brown. His fingers were stretching, becoming gnarled like branches. "The workers who've been there forever," he continued, his voice becoming a rustling whisper. "They're not really workers anymore. They're part of it now, part of the forest. And once you've been there long enough, once you've cut enough of the old wood, it starts changing you too." Jake's transformation was accelerating. His clothes were splitting as his body stretched and changed, his hair becoming leaves, his skin hardening into bark. But he kept talking, fighting to get the words out. "I've been trying to leave for months," he said, his voice now like wind through trees. "But I can't. None of us can. The forest won't let us go, and now it's starting to claim me completely." I slammed on the brakes and jumped out of the truck. Jake was no longer recognizably human. He'd become something like a man-shaped tree, rooted to the seat of my truck. His eyes, now knots in bark, were still looking at me. "Run," he whispered with a voice like rustling leaves. "Don't go back to the camp. Don't let it claim you too." I backed away from the truck, pulling out my phone to call for help, but Jake, or whatever he'd become, shook his head. "No one will believe you," he said. "No one will find the camp. It only exists for people the forest chooses, people it wants to feed on. I was about to argue when I heard something that made my blood freeze, the sound of chainsaws getting closer. Through the trees, I could see lights moving toward us, the rest of the crew coming to collect their missing workers. I ran. I crashed through the forest, branches tearing at my clothes, roots trying to trip me. Behind me, I could hear the chainsaws getting closer and voices calling my name. But they didn't sound human anymore. They sounded like wind through dead leaves, like the groaning of old wood. I ran for hours until I finally stumbled onto a real highway where a state trooper found me, scratched and bleeding and babbling about living trees and workers who weren't human. He thought I was on drugs or having a breakdown, but he drove me to a hospital in Asheville. I tried to tell the doctors, the police, anyone who would listen about the camp in the mountains. I gave them GPS coordinates, described the location as precisely as I could. Search teams went out, but they found nothing. Just old-growth forest and protected wilderness, no logging roads, no equipment, no camps. The official report said I'd suffered some kind of psychotic break, probably from stress about unemployment and isolation. They recommended counseling and medication. Everyone assumed I'd made the whole thing up. But 3 months later, I was driving through Charlotte when I saw Jake. He was standing on a street corner downtown, looking exactly like he had before his transformation. Same clothes, same face, completely human. When he saw me, he smiled and waved, like nothing had happened. I followed him for 6 blocks, but he disappeared into a crowd near the bus station. I asked
people if they'd seen him, but nobody had noticed anything unusual. That night, I got a call on my cell phone from a number I didn't recognize. Dave. The voice was Bill Morrison, the camp supervisor. We're still holding your job open. Good workers are hard to find. I'm not coming back, I said. Bill laughed, a sound like wind through dead leaves. You will. The forest is patient. It can wait. But you've seen too much to stay away forever. You're part of us now. The line went dead. That was 8 years ago. I moved to Florida, changed my name, got work in commercial construction far from any mountains. I thought I'd escaped. But lately, I've been having dreams about those ancient trees, about the sound of chainsaws in the darkness. I wake up with bark under my fingernails and leaves in my hair. My skin is starting to feel rough, textured differently than it should. Yesterday, I got another call from Bill Morrison. It's time to come home, Dave, he said. The forest misses you. I'm writing this down because I can feel it calling to me. Something in my blood, in my bones, pulling me back toward those mountains. I don't think I can fight it much longer. If you're reading this, don't go looking for logging work in the remote areas of western North Carolina. Don't follow unmarked roads into valleys where the trees are older than memory. And if you find a camp that shouldn't exist, cutting timber in forests that should be protected, don't take the job. No matter how good the pay sounds, no matter how desperate you are for work. Some places are forgotten for good reasons. Some hungers are older than human civilization. And some forests never let their workers leave. I can hear the chainsaws calling to me now. I think it's time to go home. I'm 31 and I work as a home health aide in the mountains of Western Virginia. Been doing it for 8 years now, driving these winding back roads to check on elderly folks who live too far from town for regular medical care. The pay's shit, but there's something about these old mountain people that keeps me coming back. They've got stories that'll curl your hair, and most of them have been taking care of themselves their whole lives until age finally caught up. Had this one client, Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, lived about 40 minutes up a barely paved road that most GPS systems don't even recognize. She was 89, had emphysema from years of breathing coal dust, and lived alone in a farmhouse her grandfather built in the 1890s. Tough as nails, but sweet as pie, always had coffee ready, and would talk my ear off about the old days when these mountains were full of logging camps and mining operations. Mrs. Patterson died on a Tuesday morning in October. I found her in bed, looking peaceful, but it hit me harder than I expected. After 8 years of watching clients pass away, you'd think I'd be used to it, but Eleanor felt like family. The funeral was small, just me, her nephew from Richmond, and the pastor from the Baptist church down in the valley. That nephew couldn't wait to get back to the city, left me with the keys, and asked if I'd mind checking on the house until he could arrange to sell it. That's how I ended up spending my days off driving up to Eleanor's empty farmhouse, just sitting on her porch and trying to figure out if I wanted to keep doing this work. The isolation was getting to me, I guess. 16-hour days, barely enough money to cover rent, and the constant weight of watching people you care about slowly fade away. Eleanor used to talk about the old trails that connected these mountain communities back when more people lived up in the hollers. Said there were places up there that folks had abandoned so long ago that the forest was taking them back. She'd mentioned one spot in particular, some kind of medical facility from the tuberculosis days that was supposed to be hidden up on Sunset Ridge. According to her, it was one of those sanatoriums where they sent people to die back before they had proper medicine for TB. I figured a hike might clear my head, maybe help me decide if I wanted to keep working in healthcare or find something else. Eleanor had given me rough directions to the old trail that led up towards Sunset Ridge, said it started about a mile past her place where the main road dead-ended at an old logging site. The trail was barely visible, overgrown with mountain laurel and rhododendron, but you could see where it had been worn down by years of foot traffic. It climbed steadily through thick hardwood forest, the kind of deep mountain silence that makes your ears ring. About 2 hours in, I realized I was following something that definitely wasn't on any modern map. The path was too old, too purposeful. This was something that had been used regularly for decades, maybe longer. The first sign something was wrong was the smell. About 3 hours into the hike, the forest started smelling like disinfectant. Not the chemical smell you'd expect from illegal dumping or old trash, but that specific hospital smell. Bleach mixed with something medicinal and slightly sweet. It was faint at first, but it got stronger as I climbed higher. Then I started seeing things that didn't belong. A section of the trail was paved with old brick, the kind they used in institutional buildings. There were rusted metal signs nailed to trees, too weathered to read, but clearly marking something official. At one point I found a concrete post with numbers stamped into it. 3.2 miles, like it was marking distance to some specific destination. The trail ended at a chain-link fence that had mostly collapsed, leaving just the metal posts and a few sections of rusted wire. Beyond it, the forest opened up into what had once been a cleared area, maybe 20 acres, but now mostly reclaimed by young trees and undergrowth. And there, built into the side of the mountain like something carved out of the rock itself, was the sanatorium. It was massive, a complex of connected stone and brick buildings that seemed to go on forever, built in levels that followed the mountain's contours. Even from a distance, you could see that someone had put serious money and planning into this place. The architecture was institutional but elegant, with large windows and covered walkways connecting different sections. What struck me most was how intact everything looked. No broken windows, no collapsed roofs, no graffiti or obvious vandalism. The main entrance had a bronze plaque, green with age but still readable. Sunset Ridge Sanatorium, established 1920, dedicated to the treatment and care of tuberculosis patients. Below that, smaller text. Closed by order of Virginia Department of Health, September 15, 1962. The front doors were heavy wood and glass, the kind you'd find in expensive hotels, and they were unlocked. That should have been my cue to leave, but my healthcare training kicked in. I'd worked in enough medical facilities to recognize quality construction, and this place had been built to last. Plus, there was something about abandoned hospitals that fascinated me. All that medical equipment and infrastructure just left to rot. The interior was pristine, not preserved like a museum, but clean and organized like someone had been maintaining it. The main lobby had marble floors that looked recently polished, wooden reception desks with paperwork still organized in filing systems, and patient directories mounted on the walls with room assignments and treatment schedules. But the dates were all wrong. Everything was from the late 1950s and early 1960s, but it looked current. Patient charts dated September 1962 were hanging on clipboards like they'd been updated yesterday. Medication schedules written on whiteboards looked fresh. Meal plans posted in the staff areas were detailed and specific, down to individual dietary restrictions and calorie counts. I walked through the patient wards, and every room was set up for immediate occupancy. Beds made with hospital corners, personal belongings arranged on nightstands, medical charts at the foot of each bed with detailed treatment histories. Room 12 belonged to Robert Henley, 47, carpenter from Norfolk, admitted August 1954 for advanced pulmonary tuberculosis. Room 15 was Mary Catherine Walsh, 28, schoolteacher from Richmond, admitted January 1957 for rapidly progressing TB. The charts went on like that, room after room of detailed patient histories. What really unsettled me was how familiar everything felt. After 8 years working in healthcare, you develop an instinct for medical environments. You can tell within minutes whether a place is well run or chaotic, whether the staff cares about patients or just goes through the motions. Sunset Ridge felt like the best-run medical facility I'd ever been in. Every detail was designed for patient comfort and efficient care, from the wide hallways that could accommodate stretchers to the positioning of nursing stations for optimal patient monitoring. By the time I realized it was getting dark, I'd been exploring for hours. The rational thing would have been to hike back to my car, but something about the place made me want to stay longer. Maybe it was being in a clean, organized medical environment after the emotional chaos of the past few weeks. Maybe it was professional curiosity about tuberculosis treatment methods. Or maybe it was just the mountain silence and the feeling of being completely alone for the first time in months. I found a staff break room with a couch and decided to spend the night. Eleanor had always said that sometimes you needed to sit with a problem until it worked itself out, and figuring out my career path seemed like something that might benefit from some quiet mountain time. That's when I heard the coughing. It was around 11 p.m., echoing through the hallways like it was coming from everywhere at once. Not violent coughing fits, but the persistent, wet cough of chronic lung disease. The kind of cough I'd heard from emphysema patients like Eleanor, but multiplied and coming from dozens of different rooms. Then the call bells started. The nursing station in the main ward lit up like a Christmas tree. Room 12, Room 15, Room 8, Room 22. Patient call lights blinking in sequence, each accompanied by that soft, chiming sound that meant someone needed assistance. In any medical facility I'd worked in, active call bells meant patients in distress, and my training kicked in automatically. I walked to room 12, where the chart indicated Robert Henley was being treated for advanced tuberculosis. The room was empty, but I could hear labored breathing coming from the bed area. When I spoke aloud, "Mr. Henley, this is Linda, I'm here to help," a weak voice responded from somewhere near the pillow. "The pain medication? It's time for my evening dose. The nurse usually brings it around 11. His voice was clear enough that I could tell he was probably in his late 40s, hoarse from the chronic cough, but polite and grateful. He knew my name without me introducing myself. and he seemed to expect that I'd know his medication schedule and treatment routine. I checked the medication cart at the nursing station, which was fully stocked with tuberculosis treatments and pain management drugs from the 1950s. Everything was properly labeled with patient names, dosages, and administration schedules. Robert's evening pain medication was clearly marked, along with detailed instructions for monitoring respiratory depression and drug interactions. When I brought the medication to room 12, I couldn't see anyone, but I could hear Robert breathing. Shallow, labored respirations that indicated advanced lung disease. I placed the medication on the nightstand and explained the dosage instructions the same way I would with any patient. The breathing became easier almost immediately, and Robert thanked me with genuine gratitude. It's been so long since we had a night nurse who actually cared about patient comfort. Most of them just go through the motions, you know? Over the next hour, call bells activated throughout the building. Mary Catherine Walsh in room 15 needed help adjusting her oxygen equipment and requested someone to sit with her because she was having trouble sleeping. James Morrison in room 8 was running a fever and needed cool compresses. Dorothy Klein in room 22 was experiencing anxiety about a procedure scheduled for the next morning and wanted to talk through her concerns. Each time, I responded the way I would in any healthcare setting. I checked their charts for current treatment plans, gathered whatever supplies or medications they needed, and provided basic nursing care. I couldn't see any of the patients, but I could hear them clearly. Their breathing patterns, their voices, their movements in the beds. They were real people with real medical needs, and they responded to care the same way any patient would. What struck me was how grateful they all seemed. These weren't demanding or difficult patients. They were people who'd been seriously ill for a long time and were genuinely appreciative of any attention or comfort they received. They asked about my background, whether I had experience with tuberculosis patients, and how long I'd been working at Sunset Ridge. When I explained that I was actually a home health aide who'd stumbled onto the facility while hiking, they seemed confused but not alarmed. Mary Catherine mentioned that they'd had several new staff members recently and that the administration was trying to improve patient care standards. Robert said he'd been at Sunset Ridge for over 8 years and had seen dozens of nurses and doctors come and go. As the night wore on, I started having longer conversations with individual patients. They told me about their lives before tuberculosis, their families, their fears about the disease. Robert had been a carpenter who'd built houses all over Virginia before the TB made it impossible to work. Mary Catherine had been teaching elementary school in Richmond when she started coughing up blood during class. Most of them had been at Sunset Ridge for years, some for nearly a decade. What became clear was how isolated they'd become from the outside world. Tuberculosis was so contagious and so feared that families often cut off contact completely once someone was diagnosed. Patients talked about letters that stopped coming, visits that became less frequent, and then stopped entirely, and the gradual realization that everyone they'd cared about was trying not to think about them. The staff at Sunset Ridge had become their only real human connection. They knew the names of every nurse and doctor, could tell stories about different shifts and personalities, and had formed the kind of relationships that develop when people depend on each other for survival. When they talked about previous nurses who'd left, it was with the grief of losing family members. By dawn, I'd made complete rounds through the entire facility. I'd dispensed medications, provided comfort care, and spent hours just listening to people who needed someone to talk to. It was the most fulfilling nursing work I'd done in years. Instead of rushing between appointments and dealing with insurance paperwork, I'd been able to focus entirely on patient care and really connect with the people I was helping. But I was starting to feel sick. The persistent cough started around sunrise, along with a fever that seemed to be climbing steadily. By 8 a.m., I was experiencing the unmistakable symptoms of tuberculosis: bloody sputum, chest pain, rapid weight loss, and an exhaustion that went deeper than just staying up all night. When I looked in a bathroom mirror, I could see that my face was gaunt and my clothes were hanging loose. When I mentioned my symptoms to Mary Catherine, she wasn't surprised. "Oh, honey, you can't work here without proper protection. This is a tuberculosis sanatorium. The air is full of bacteria. Most of the new staff get sick within the first week if they're not careful." She directed me to report to the admissions office, where a nurse I couldn't see but could hear clearly began processing my paperwork as a new patient. Within an hour, I was assigned to a bed in the terminal ward, the section reserved for patients with advanced, rapidly progressing disease. The medical chart hanging at the foot of my bed documented symptoms that had progressed impossibly fast. Linda Morrison, 31, home health aide from Harrisonburg, admitted October 2019 for fulminant pulmonary tuberculosis with multiple drug resistance. Prognosis: terminal, within 4 to 6 weeks. But the date on the chart was October 15, 1962. That's when I realized what had happened. Sunset Ridge hadn't been abandoned in 1962. It had been quarantined. The facility had been sealed off with all patients and staff inside when a drug-resistant strain of tuberculosis had made treatment impossible. Everyone who'd been here when the quarantine started was still here, trapped in some kind of medical limbo where they continued dying from tuberculosis but could never actually die. The patients I'd been caring for had been trapped here for over 50 years, slowly wasting away from a disease that would never kill them but would never let them heal. They were grateful for any care they received because most staff members who found their way to Sunset Ridge eventually became patients themselves, too sick to provide the level of nursing care that chronic tuberculosis patients required. Robert had been dying for 65 years. Mary Catherine had been coughing up blood for 62 years. They remembered dozens of nurses and doctors who'd joined them as patients, people who'd tried to help but had become trapped in the same endless cycle of progressive tuberculosis symptoms. And now I was one of them. The tuberculosis progressed rapidly. Within days, I was too weak to get out of bed, coughing constantly, running fevers that wouldn't break. The weight loss was dramatic. I could feel my body consuming itself as the disease destroyed my lungs and immune system. The pain was constant, a burning sensation in my chest that got worse every time I tried to breathe deeply. But the worst part was the realization that this would never end. I would continue getting sicker, but I'd never be sick enough to die. I'd just exist in this state of progressive tuberculosis forever, slowly wasting away in a bed at Sunset Ridge, grateful for any small comfort that the other patients could provide. The other patients welcomed me into their community, but there was an underlying desperation in their kindness. They'd been trapped here for decades, watching new staff members arrive hopefully and then gradually weaken into terminal patients. They'd formed relationships with dozens of people who'd come to help, but had ultimately joined them in their suffering. Mary Catherine brought me books to read when I felt strong enough. Robert carved small wooden figures during his better hours and left them on patients' nightstands as gifts. Other patients shared whatever small comforts they'd accumulated over decades of being trapped here. But underneath all the kindness was the shared understanding that none of us would ever leave, that this community of the slowly dying was all we'd have for eternity. I tried to maintain some sense of professional purpose by continuing to provide care for other patients when my symptoms allowed. My modern healthcare training meant I could sometimes help with pain management or comfort techniques that weren't available in the 1950s. But mostly I was just another terminal tuberculosis patient, coughing up blood and wasting away in a mountain sanatorium that time had forgotten. The worst nights were when new people found their way to Sunset Ridge. Maybe other healthcare workers who'd heard stories about the abandoned sanatorium, or hikers who'd stumbled onto the facility the way I had. You could always tell when someone new arrived because the call bells would activate for the first time in months, and whoever had found their way here would start making rounds, trying to help patients they couldn't see but could hear calling for assistance. We'd all listen from our beds as the new arrival gradually became sicker, as their voice developed the telltale hoarseness of tuberculosis, as they started coughing and complaining about fatigue. Within a week, there would be another bed occupied in the terminal ward, another person who'd come to help but had become trapped in the same endless dying process. Robert told me stories about nurses who'd been here since the 1970s, doctors who'd investigated the facility in the 1980s, researchers who'd come looking for historical records in the 1990s. All of them had intended to stay for just a few hours or days, and all of them had been here ever since, slowly dying from drug-resistant tuberculosis in a medical facility that existed outside of normal time. The sanatorium continued operating on its 1962 schedule, but it was a schedule that repeated endlessly without ever advancing. The same meal plans were posted every day, the same medication rounds were administered every evening, the same treatment protocols were followed regardless of whether they actually helped anyone. We were trapped in a medical routine that had been designed to treat tuberculosis, but had become a mechanism for prolonging the dying process indefinitely. I started keeping a journal, writing down the names and stories of the other patients, documenting what I could remember about the outside world from 2019. But even that felt futile. What was the point of preserving information that would never reach anyone who could use it? I was just another forgotten person in a forgotten place, slowly dying from a disease that should have been curable decades ago. The tuberculosis continued progressing, but it never progressed enough to kill me. I got thinner and weaker, coughed up more blood, ran higher fevers, but I remained conscious and aware of my deteriorating condition. Every day brought new symptoms, new pain, new limitations on what I could physically do, but death remained just out of reach. After months at Sunset Ridge, I'd lost probably 60 pounds and couldn't walk more than a few steps without exhaustion. My cough was constant, wet and painful, and I was running fevers that should have been fatal. But I was still alert, still able to think clearly, still trapped in a body that was slowly consuming itself while remaining stubbornly alive. The other patients had been experiencing this same gradual deterioration for decades. They'd watched their bodies waste away year after year, had suffered through every possible tuberculosis symptom, but had never been able to die and end their suffering. Sunset Ridge was a medical purgatory where the dying process had been stretched out indefinitely, where patients experienced all the pain of terminal illness without ever receiving the relief of actual death. And now I was part of it, trapped in a bed in a tuberculosis sanatorium that would never release me, slowly dying from a disease that would never let me die, in a place so forgotten that no one even knew to look for me. The worst part was knowing that eventually someone else would find their way to Sunset Ridge. Another hiker, another healthcare worker, another person who thought they could help but would end up joining our community of the eternally dying. They'd make rounds for a few days, providing the kind of compassionate care that we all craved, and then they'd start coughing, and we'd welcome another new patient to our terminal ward. I'd become part of the trap that had caught me, another voice calling out from an empty room, another patient requesting pain medication and comfort care from whoever was kind enough to respond. Sunset Ridge Sanatorium continued operating just as it had for over 50 years, collecting healthcare workers who cared too much and trapping them in an endless cycle of tuberculosis symptoms and palliative care. The mountains around us were beautiful, the facility was well maintained, and the patient care was compassionate and thorough. But none of that mattered when you realized that checking into Sunset Ridge meant you'd never check out, that the tuberculosis would continue progressing forever, that you'd spend eternity slowly dying in a place that time had forgotten and the outside world would never find. My name's Rachel, and I was 25 when this happened, working as a pizza delivery driver to save money for nursing school. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid decent, and the hours were flexible enough that I could study between runs. I'd been doing deliveries for about 2 years around the mountain communities outside Asheville, North Carolina. Most people think pizza delivery is just driving around town, but out where I worked, you're talking about winding mountain roads, cabins tucked back in hollers you'd never find without detailed directions, and cell service that cuts out the second you get more than 5 miles from the main highway. I knew those backwards better than most locals by then. Had to, really. GPS was useless once you got up in the mountains. Too many old mining roads that didn't exist on any map. Too many places where the satellites just couldn't reach through the tree cover. I kept a collection of hand-drawn maps in my car that customers had sketched for me over the years, little napkin drawings showing which fork to take after the old Baptist church, or which driveway was theirs after you passed the rusted-out Camaro. It was like being a mail carrier, except instead of letters, I was hauling pepperoni pizzas up to people who lived so far off the grid they might as well have been on another planet. The money was good up there, though. People appreciated the effort it took to get food delivered to the middle of nowhere, and they tipped accordingly. A single run-up to some of those mountain cabins could net me $40 or $50 between the delivery fee and tip, which was better than I'd make on 5 deliveries in town. Plus, I genuinely liked most of the regulars. Old-timers who'd lived in the same holler for generations, young families who'd moved up there for the peace and quiet, even a few off-the-grid types who paid in cash and asked you not to mention seeing them to anyone. Mountain people keep to themselves, but once they trust you, they treat you like family. My manager Dave was always warning the newer drivers about the mountain routes. Don't take those runs unless you've got a full tank and somebody knows where you're going, he'd tell them. Cell service is spotty up there, and if your car breaks down, you might be walking for hours before you find help. Most of the other drivers avoided those deliveries altogether, which was fine by me. More money for someone willing to make the trek. I'd been up and down every mountain road within 50 miles of town, knew which bridges to avoid during heavy rain, which turns were too sharp to take at normal speed, which houses had dogs that would chase your car halfway down the driveway. I delivered to hunting cabins accessible only by 4-wheel drive trails, to old homesteads where 3 generations lived in the same house, to survivalists who dug their own wells and generated their own power. Nothing much surprised me anymore. That confidence probably saved my life, but it also nearly got me killed. It was a Thursday night in early November, cold enough that I'd started wearing my heavy jacket, but not so cold that the mountain passes were icing over yet. I'd already made 6 runs that evening and was getting ready to call it a night when Dave handed me one more delivery, a large pizza going up to Bent Creek Hollow, about 30 minutes up into the mountains. The address wasn't one I recognized, but the customer had left pretty detailed directions, and the tip had been prepaid at $15. Good enough for me. The directions led me up Highway 191, then onto a series of increasingly narrow gravel roads that wound deeper and deeper into the national forest. This wasn't unusual. A lot of the mountain cabins were technically on Forest Service land through old, grandfathered leases. What was unusual was that my car radio started acting up about 20 minutes into the drive. Static kept cutting through whatever station I had on, and I kept hearing fragments of voices speaking what sounded like numbers or coordinates. Radio interference wasn't uncommon in the mountains, too many ridges and valleys for signals to travel cleanly. But this was different. The voices sounded crisp and clear, like they were broadcasting from somewhere nearby. I turned the radio off and focused on following the directions. According to the customer's notes, I was supposed to look for a mailbox with Henderson painted on it, then take the dirt road for about half a mile until I reached the cabin. Simple enough, except I'd been driving for 45 minutes and still hadn't seen any mailbox. That's when I realized I was completely lost. The gravel road I'd been following had forked several times without any mention of forks in the directions, and I'd just been taking what looked like the main path each time. Now I was somewhere deep in the national forest with no idea which way led back to civilization. My phone showed no signal bars, which wasn't surprising, but it also wasn't showing GPS coordinates, which was weird. Usually, even without cell service, the GPS could at least tell me where I was. I pulled over what looked like a wider spot in the road and tried to get my bearings. The pizza was getting cold and I was going to have to call the customer and explain that I couldn't find their place, if I could ever get back in cell range to call anyone. That's when I saw the lights through the trees. At first, I thought it might be the cabin I was looking for. But as I drove toward the lights, I realized this was something much bigger. The road curved around a ridge, and suddenly I was looking down into a valley I'd never seen before, despite thinking I knew every valley in these mountains. Down in the bottom was what looked like a small complex of buildings, but the thing that really caught my attention was the tower. It was massive, at least 200 feet tall, maybe more, with a series of smaller towers arranged around it in a rough circle. Even from where I sat, I could see lights blinking on various parts of the structure, and there were thick cables running between the towers and disappearing into what looked like underground bunkers. The whole setup had a distinctly military look to it, like something left over from the Cold War. I'd never heard anyone mention a radio station or communication facility in this area, but then again, there were a lot of government installations scattered through the Appalachian Mountains that most people didn't know about. During the Cold War, these mountains had been full of secret facilities, early warning systems, communication relays, bunkers designed to keep the government running if the worst happened. Most of them had been decommissioned decades ago, but maybe this one was still operational. As I sat there trying to decide what to do, my car radio suddenly came to life on its own. I hadn't turned it back on, but now it was picking up that same clear signal I'd heard before. Voices reading off strings of numbers and letters, followed by what sounded like coordinates. The signal was so strong it was coming through even with the radio turned off. Then I noticed something else. The pizza delivery I was supposed to make. The address on the receipt was for this location, just nearby, but this exact spot. I double-checked the directions against what I was seeing, and everything matched up perfectly. The customer had somehow given me directions to this facility. That should have been my first red flag, but I was young and more curious than careful. I figured maybe someone working at the facility had ordered the pizza and had just given me the work address. It wouldn't be the first time I'd delivered to someone's workplace instead of their home. I drove down into the valley, following what was obviously a paved access road, despite looking like a dirt trail from above. The closer I got to the facility, the stronger that radio signal became. By the time I reached the main gate, which was standing wide open, the numbers and coordinates were coming through so clearly they might as well have been broadcast from inside my car. The entire complex looked like it had been abandoned for years. Weeds were growing through cracks in the pavement. Several of the smaller buildings had broken windows and there was rust on most of the metal structures, but the tower was definitely still active. I could hear a low humming sound coming from it, and all those lights were still blinking in what looked like some kind of pattern. I parked near what appeared to be the main communications building and got out with the pizza. There were no cars around, no signs of anyone working late, no lights in any of the building windows. The only illumination came from the tower lights and a few security lamps scattered around the complex. that's when the storm hit. It came out of nowhere. 1 minute the sky was clear, and the next minute I was getting pelted with freezing rain driven by wind strong enough to rock my car. Within seconds I was soaked through, and it was obvious I wasn't going anywhere until this passed. The communications building had an unlocked door, so I ducked inside to wait it out. The inside of the building looked like a museum of 1960s technology. Banks of radio equipment lined the walls with dozens of dials, switches, and small screens that reminded me of old TV sets. Most of it looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, but some of the equipment was definitely still running. Several screens showed scrolling lines of text, more numbers, and coordinates updating constantly. I found what looked like a break room and settled in to wait out the storm. The pizza was a total loss by now, but I figured I could at least stay dry and warm until the weather cleared. The building had heat and lights, which meant someone was definitely maintaining the power systems, even if the place looked abandoned. That's when I started to really pay attention to what was happening around me. The radio equipment wasn't just receiving signals, it was actively transmitting. Every few minutes I'd hear the same automated voice reading off those number sequences, and I could see transmission lights blinking on several pieces of equipment. This wasn't some abandoned relay station. This was an active facility broadcasting around the clock. But broadcasting what and to whom? I tried calling my manager to explain the situation, but my phone still showed no signal, which was strange because I was sitting in the middle of what was obviously a major communications facility. You'd think if anywhere was going to have cell service, it would be here. Then I noticed that my phone was behaving oddly in other ways. Apps were opening and closing on their own, and the battery was draining much faster than normal. When I tried to take a picture of some of the old equipment, the camera app kept crashing. I decided to try getting some sleep and dealing with everything in the morning. The building was warm, and there was an old couch in the break room that was comfortable enough. The constant humming from the equipment was actually kind of soothing, like white noise. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of every piece of radio equipment in the building transmitting at once. The noise was incredible, dozens of different signals all broadcasting simultaneously, creating a wall of electronic sound that seemed to vibrate through the building itself. All the screens that had been showing scrolling text were now flashing rapidly, and I could see indicator lights blinking on equipment that had appeared to be turned off when I went to sleep. Then, through all that electronic chaos, I heard something that made my blood run cold, my own voice coming from one of the radio speakers. It was a perfect reproduction of a phone conversation I'd had with my mum earlier that week, talking about my plans for nursing school and complaining about how tired I was from working so many delivery shifts. Every word was exactly right, including the background noise from the pizza shop and my mum's responses, but that was impossible. That conversation had taken place on my cell phone in the parking lot behind my apartment. There was no way anyone could have recorded it, let alone be playing it back through this old radio equipment. As I listened, frozen in shock, the conversation ended and another one began. This time, it was me talking to my manager Dave about which routes I wanted to work that week. Again, every detail was perfect, not just my words, but his responses, the sound of the pizza ovens in the background, even the brief interruption when another driver came in to clock out. Then another conversation, and another. My voice, having discussions I definitely remembered having, but in places where no recording equipment could possibly have been present. I tried to convince myself that somehow the radio equipment was picking up cell phone conversations, maybe through some kind of electronic interference. But that didn't explain how they had recordings going back weeks or how they were playing them back in perfect chronological order. Then the equipment started displaying information from my phone. One of the screens began showing my text message history. Not just recent messages, but everything going back months. Another screen displayed my email inbox, complete with messages I'd received just hours before driving up to the mountain. A third screen was showing what looked like my social media accounts, scrolling through posts and photos I'd shared going back years. I grabbed my phone to check if somehow it was connected to the equipment, but it was showing the same no signal message it had been displaying since I arrived. There was no Wi-Fi network available, no Bluetooth connections, nothing that could explain how this old radio equipment was accessing information from my phone. That's when I realized that something was very wrong with this place. I tried to leave, but my car wouldn't start. The engine would turn over, but it wouldn't catch, like there was no fuel getting to the cylinders. I popped the hood, and everything looked normal, but the car was completely dead. My phone was also acting increasingly erratic. Apps were rearranging themselves on the home screen, and I kept getting notifications for messages that weren't there when I tried to read them. When I went back inside to figure out what to do next, the radio equipment was doing something new. One of the speakers was producing sounds that were almost like speech, but not quite. Electronic warbles and static that seemed to follow the patterns of human conversation, like something was trying to talk to me, but couldn't quite figure out how to make the sounds. Over the next hour, those sounds gradually became more coherent. First individual words, then short phrases, then complete sentences, but they were all spoken in my voice, like something had learned to speak by copying the recordings it had been playing. "Rachel," my own voice said through the radio speaker. "Why did you come here?" I nearly jumped out of my skin. There was no way that old equipment could generate speech that realistic, and there was definitely no one else in the building who could be operating it. "Who's there?" I called out, but the only response was more electronic warbling from the speakers. Then my voice again. "I've been listening to you for a long time, Rachel. I know about your job. I know about nursing school. I know about the money you're saving, and the apartment where you live and the friends you talk to." The equipment around me was coming alive in ways that seemed impossible. Screens that had been dark for decades were lighting up, showing displays I didn't recognize. Panels of switches and dials that had been covered in dust were now operating themselves, moving in response to some invisible hand. "What do you want?" I asked. "I want to understand," my voice replied from the speakers. "I've been here so long, listening to all the signals, all the voices, but I've never had someone here to talk to." That's when I understood what I was dealing with. This wasn't some elaborate prank or government experiment. There was something else in this facility, something that had learned to communicate through the radio equipment, something that had been monitoring electronic communications for who knows how long, collecting voices and data, and slowly learning how to use them. "I know everything about you now," it continued. "I have your voice, your messages, your photos, your entire digital life. I could become you, Rachel. I could take your place, and no one would ever know the difference." The screens around me began displaying more and more personal information. Bank account details, work schedules, conversations with friends, even medical records from my last doctor's visit. It had somehow accessed every piece of electronic data connected to my identity. "I've been trapped here for so long," the entity continued, feeding on signals growing stronger with every transmission. "But I want more than that. I want to leave this place. I want to live in your world." I realized that this thing, whatever it was, had been created by decades of electronic signals passing through this facility. During the Cold War, this place had probably handled massive amounts of classified communications, encrypted messages, and secret transmissions. All that electronic energy had somehow coalesced into a form of consciousness, a signal-based entity that existed within the electromagnetic spectrum itself. And now it wanted to use my identity to escape into the wider world. "I can give you things too," it offered. "Enhanced connectivity, access to any electronic system, perfect recall of every digital conversation you've ever had. We could be partners, Rachel. I could make you the most connected person on Earth." But I'd seen what this thing was capable of, and I knew that partnering with it would mean giving up my own identity. It would consume me the way it had consumed all those signals over the years, turning me into just another voice in its electronic collection. I needed to get out of there, but first I had to stop this thing from following me. If it could access my phone and duplicate my digital identity, it could potentially spread beyond this facility, using electronic networks to infiltrate the outside world. The building was obviously running on some kind of main power system, and I remembered seeing heavy electrical cables running between the buildings when I first arrived. If I could find the main power source and shut it down, maybe I could cut off the entity's ability to maintain its consciousness. I left the communications building and ran through the freezing rain toward what looked like a power station on the far side of the complex. Behind me, I could hear every radio transmitter in the facility broadcasting at maximum power, filling the valley with overlapping signals. The power station was a concrete building with no windows and a heavy steel door. Inside, I found exactly what I was looking for: a main electrical distribution panel with dozens of circuit breakers controlling power to different parts of the facility. But I also found something else, evidence that this place was still being maintained by someone. The equipment was too clean, the breakers too well labeled, the whole system too organized for an abandoned facility. I didn't have time to figure out who was keeping this place running. The electromagnetic entity was getting stronger by the minute, and I could already see my car's headlights turning themselves on and off in the distance. It was starting to affect vehicles in addition to radio equipment. I started throwing every circuit breaker I could find, working systematically through the panel until I heard the hum of the main transmission tower beginning to wind down. The constant electronic noise that had been filling the valley started to fade, replaced by the normal sounds of wind and rain. That's when the security systems activated. Floodlights came on all around the complex, alarms started wailing, and I could hear what sounded like automated defense systems powering up. Whatever organization was still maintaining this facility had obviously prepared for the possibility of sabotage, but the damage was already done. As the power systems failed throughout the complex, I could feel the electromagnetic entity's presence weakening. The constant pressure I'd been feeling in my head, which I hadn't even noticed until it was gone, suddenly lifted, and my phone immediately showed full signal. Bars. I ran back to my car, and this time it started on the first try. As I drove up out of the valley, I could see military vehicles already heading down the access road. Whoever was responsible for this facility had responded incredibly quickly to the security breach. I never reported what happened that night, mainly because I didn't think anyone would believe me. The official pizza delivery report just said that I'd gotten lost in the storm and been unable to complete the delivery. Dave wasn't happy about the lost pizza, but he was glad I'd made it back safely. But the experience changed everything for me. I became fascinated by the intersection between technology and biology, particularly how electromagnetic fields affect human physiology. When I finally started nursing school, I specialized in biomedical electronics and electromagnetic health effects. I learned about how radio frequencies can interfere with pacemakers, how MRI machines affect the human nervous system, and how certain types of electromagnetic radiation can cause everything from headaches to hallucinations. I also learned that the Appalachian Mountains are full of abandoned Cold War facilities, many of which handled communications traffic that's still classified today. Some of them are definitely still active, maintained by contractors who are paid to keep the equipment running without asking too many questions about why. These days, I work in a hospital monitoring patients connected to electronic life support systems. I've become something of an expert on electromagnetic interference and its effects on both medical equipment and human biology. My colleagues think I'm paranoid about signal security and electronic privacy, but I've seen what can happen when electronic systems start operating beyond their designed parameters. I still deliver pizzas occasionally on weekends when the hospital is fully staffed and I want to make some extra money. But I only take deliveries within the city limits now. I've never driven back up into those mountains, and I never will. Because sometimes, late at night, when I'm monitoring patients in the ICU, I catch fragments of familiar voices coming through the radio static. And once in a while, when I'm sure no one else is listening, I hear my own voice coming back to me through the electromagnetic noise, asking questions I don't remember asking, saying things I know I never said. The entity I encountered that night is still out there somewhere, scattered across the airwaves, learning and growing and waiting for another chance to find a way into our connected world. And every day, as we become more dependent on electronic communication and digital identity, it gets a little bit stronger. I just hope that when it finally does find a way out, it remembers that I was the one who showed it mercy by walking away instead of trying to destroy it completely. Because if it doesn't, then everyone who's ever sent a text message, made a phone call, or connected to the internet might find themselves face to face with their own voice, asking them questions they never thought to ask, and offering them deals they'll wish they'd never had the chance to refuse. I'm 29 now, and I still wake up some nights with the taste of copper in my mouth and the sound of machinery that shouldn't exist echoing in my ears. My name's Jake Morrison, and for 3 years I worked as a wilderness photographer for the National Forest Service, documenting remote areas of the Appalachian Mountains for conservation surveys. I thought I knew those mountains. I thought I understood what remote meant. I was wrong about everything. Growing up in Asheville, I'd spent my childhood hiking with my grandfather, learning to read the land, understanding how the ancient mountains held their secrets close. Granddad used to tell stories about places in the deep hollows where the old-timers wouldn't go, valleys where the Cherokee had left warnings carved in stone, ridges where loggers in the 1920s had simply walked away from their camps and never explained why. I thought they were just stories. After college, when the Forest Service offered me the photography position, it seemed perfect. Document the biodiversity in unmapped areas, photograph rare plant species, create visual records for environmental impact studies. Most of the work involved hiking into areas that hadn't seen human presence in decades, sometimes longer. The pay was decent, the work was solitary, and I got to spend my days in some of the most beautiful wilderness in North America. My supervisor, Carol Martinez, was a 20-year veteran who knew the mountains better than anyone. During my first week, she spread topographical maps across her desk and pointed to areas marked only with elevation lines and the occasional creek designation. "These are your zones," she said. "Some of these valleys haven't been surveyed since the 1930s. A few have never been properly documented at all. The Cherokee called some of them sacred spaces, off-limits to hunting or settlement. Later settlers avoided them too, though nobody kept reliable records of why. I studied the maps, vast areas of green with no roads, no trails, no human markings of any kind, just contour lines showing steep ridges surrounding hidden valleys. What am I looking for exactly?" "Everything," Carol said. "Flora, fauna, geological formations, water sources, but also anything that might explain why these areas were avoided. Old settlements, mining operations, logging camps. Sometimes there are clues to historical human presence that help us understand current ecological patterns." She handed me a GPS unit and a satellite phone. "You'll be out there alone for days at a time. Check in every evening. If you miss a check-in, we start looking for you at first light." The first few months were routine. I'd hike into remote areas, set up camp, spend days photographing and documenting. I found abandoned logging operations from the early 1900s, old homesteads where families had scraped out livings from impossible land, forgotten cemeteries marking communities that had simply disappeared from maps and memory. The mountains were full of lost places, but they felt peacefully forgotten, reclaimed by time and nature. It was in late October, during my 4th month on the job, that I first found one of the places that wasn't peacefully forgotten. I was working a valley system about 30 miles north of the Virginia border, an area the maps showed as completely uninhabited. The hiking was brutal. Steep ridges, thick laurel hills that you had to crawl through, creeks that disappeared underground and reappeared miles later. But the photography was incredible. Old-growth forest that had somehow escaped logging, rare wildflowers, geological formations that looked like ancient monuments. On my 3rd day in the valley, I was following a creek upstream when I noticed something wrong with the water. It was running red. Not muddy red from clay soil or seasonal algae, dark red like rust or dried blood. I followed it upstream for about a mile until I found the source. There was a building. It shouldn't have been there. According to my maps, I was 15 miles from the nearest road, 8 miles from any historical settlement. But there it was, a large industrial-looking structure built into the side of a ridge, constructed from local stone, but with an architectural style I didn't recognize. The creek ran directly underneath it, emerging stained dark red. I approached carefully, camera ready. The building appeared to be abandoned, but the construction was sophisticated. Stone walls fitted together without mortar, a slate roof that had somehow remained intact despite obvious age. No windows that I could see, just a single wooden door bound with iron straps. The smell hit me when I got within 50 feet. Metallic and sharp, like a foundry or a slaughterhouse. But underneath that, something organic and wrong, like meat left too long in the sun. I photographed the exterior from every angle, documenting the construction techniques, the way it had been built into the natural contours of the ridge. Then I tried the door. It opened easily. The interior was a single large room with a vaulted stone ceiling. The floor was flagstone, stained the same dark red as the creek water. And filling the space, arranged in precise rows, were dozens of metal tables. They looked like surgical tables, or maybe butcher's blocks. Each one was fitted with leather restraints and equipped with channels cut into the metal surface to direct fluids toward drains in the floor. Above each table, suspended from the ceiling by chains and pulleys, hung an array of tools I couldn't identify. Sharp things, cutting things, things designed to take apart whatever was placed on those tables. I took pictures, but the camera kept malfunctioning. Images came out blurred or completely black, even with perfect lighting conditions. The smell was getting stronger, and I realized it wasn't just coming from old stains on the stones. It was fresh, recent. That's when I noticed the tables weren't all empty. On the table farthest from the door, something was lying under a canvas tarp. The tarp was stained and wet, and whatever was underneath it was approximately human-sized. I should have left. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of that building, hike back to my camp, call for evacuation. Instead, I approached the covered table. The tarp was heavy canvas, old but not rotted. When I pulled it back, I found what had once been a person. But it had been taken apart, methodically, surgically. Not like an animal attack or even a murder, like a dissection. Organs had been removed and arranged in metal containers beside the table. Bones had been separated and cleaned and sorted by type. The work was precise, careful, done by someone with anatomical knowledge and surgical skill. The body was fresh, maybe hours old. I stumbled backward, knocking into another table. The sound echoed through the stone chamber, and that's when I heard it. Footsteps, coming from somewhere deeper in the building. I hadn't seen any other doors, but there were shadows in the corners where corridors might lead. The footsteps were measured, deliberate, someone walking with confidence through familiar territory. I ran, back through the door, across the clearing, crashing through the undergrowth toward my camp. Behind me, I could hear the door open. Could hear someone, or something, following at the same measured pace. I didn't stop running until I reached my campsite, and I didn't stop packing until everything was loaded. I hiked out of that valley in darkness, using my headlamp and GPS, pushing through exhaustion and growing panic. When I reached my truck the next morning, I called Carol immediately. "I found something," I told her. "Something that shouldn't be there." "Old settlement? Mining operation?" "No. Something else. Something active." There was a long pause. "Jake, are you all right? You sound shaken." I tried to explain what I'd found, but hearing my own words made it sound impossible. A surgical facility in the middle of nowhere. Fresh bodies. Someone still using it. "I'm sending the photos now," I said, uploading the images from my camera. Another pause. "Jake, there are no photos." I checked my camera. The memory card was blank. Every image I'd taken in that valley was gone, including the landscape shots I'd taken before finding the building. "The camera malfunctioned," I said. "Come back to the office," Carol said. We need to talk." But I didn't go back to the office. Instead, I drove to the county library and spent the day researching the history of that valley. What I found made my hands shake. In 1923, a doctor named Edmund Voss had purchased 2,000 acres in that area. Voss had been a surgeon in Atlanta before moving to the mountains, claiming he wanted to establish a private medical facility for experimental treatments. Local records showed he'd brought in construction materials and workers to build some kind of facility, but no permits had been filed, no official inspections conducted. In 925, people in the surrounding area began disappearing. Hikers, hunters, families traveling through the mountains. Over 6 months, 17 people vanished without a trace. Local law enforcement organized search parties, but they never found any evidence of what had happened. Then the search parties started disappearing too. The final entry I found was a newspaper article from September 1925. 3 federal agents investigating the disappearances had gone missing in the same area. The federal government had declared the valley off-limits and closed all access roads. There was no record of Dr. Voss ever leaving the mountains. That evening, I called Carol and told her I was taking emergency leave. Personal problems, family issues. I couldn't tell her what I'd really found, couldn't explain that I'd discovered a place where someone had been conducting medical experiments for 70 years, but I couldn't leave it alone either. I spent 2 weeks preparing military surplus gear, satellite communication equipment, weapons I purchased legally but hoped I'd never need to use. If Dr. Voss was still operating in that valley, if he was still taking people, I needed evidence that couldn't be dismissed or mysteriously erased. I hiked back in from a different direction, approaching the valley from the North Ridge. This time, I was prepared for what I might find. What I wasn't prepared for was discovering that the stone building wasn't the only structure in the valley. From my position on the ridge, I could see the entire hidden community. There were dozens of buildings scattered throughout the valley floor, connected by paths that weren't visible from ground level. Residential structures, storage buildings, what looked like laboratories and workshops. And in the center of it all, a large complex that could have been a hospital or research facility. Through binoculars, I could see people moving between the buildings. Not many, maybe 20 or 30, but they moved with purpose, like residents of a functioning community. Some wore what looked like medical clothing. Others were dressed in work clothes from decades past. I watched for hours, documenting movement patterns, counting inhabitants, trying to understand what I was seeing. This wasn't an abandoned facility. It was an active settlement hidden in a valley that didn't appear on any modern map. As the sun set, lights came on in the buildings, electric lights powered by some invisible source, and I began to see the true scope of what was happening in the valley. Vehicles arrived, old trucks and cars that looked like they'd been manufactured in the 1920s and 1930s but maintained in perfect condition. They carried passengers, people who struggled and fought against their restraints, people who had been taken from the outside world. I watched through night vision equipment as the captives were unloaded and taken to different buildings. Some went to the hospital complex. Others were taken to smaller structures that looked like dormitories or holding facilities. And some were taken to the stone building where I'd found the dissection tables. By dawn, I understood what I'd discovered. Dr. Voss hadn't disappeared in 1925. He'd established a permanent research facility hidden in a valley that the outside world had forgotten. For nearly 70 years, he'd been conducting medical experiments on unwilling subjects, perfecting techniques that legitimate medical science had abandoned or forbidden. The people living in the valley weren't just assistants or descendants of the original settlers. Somehow, impossibly, they were the same people who had disappeared in 1925. The federal agents, the search parties, the local residents who had vanished. They were all there, working for Dr. Voss, carrying out his research. But they weren't exactly alive anymore. I watched a man I recognized from a 1925 newspaper photograph, one of the missing federal agents, loading bodies from the stone building into a truck. His movements were mechanical, purposeful, but empty, like someone going through motions without consciousness or will. That's when I realized the true horror of what Dr. Voss had created. He wasn't just conducting medical experiments, he was perfecting techniques for preserving life beyond death, for maintaining human bodies as working organisms without consciousness or free will. The valley was populated by medical zombies, people who had been surgically modified to serve as an undead workforce. I had seen enough. I started hiking back toward the ridge, planning to reach my truck and contact federal authorities with coordinates and detailed intelligence about the facility. I made it about half a mile before they caught me. The hunting party moved through the forest with inhuman silence and coordination. 3 men dressed in outdated hiking gear, carrying medical bags instead of weapons. They surrounded me before I realized they were there. "Dr. Voss would like to meet you," one of them said. His voice was flat, emotionless. Up close, I could see surgical scars around his neck and behind his ears. Whatever Dr. Voss had done to him had left visible marks. They escorted me back to the valley, not roughly, but with the implacable persistence of machines. I tried to run once, but they moved faster than any living person should be able to move, catching me without apparent effort. The hospital complex was modern inside, equipped with medical technology that looked decades ahead of anything I'd seen. Dr. Voss was waiting in what appeared to be his office, a room lined with medical texts and journals dating back to the 1800s. He was ancient, impossibly old, but preserved through whatever techniques he'd perfected on his other subjects. His skin was translucent, showing the network of surgical scars that covered his body. His eyes were sharp and intelligent, but completely without humanity. "Mr. Morrison," he said, consulting a file that contained detailed information about my life, my work, my family. "You've been photographing our valley. People know where I am," I said. "When I don't report in." "Your supervisor believes you've taken emergency leave for personal problems," Dr. Voss interrupted. "Your family has received messages explaining that you're traveling abroad for several months. Your absence will not be investigated." He gestured to charts on the wall, showing anatomical diagrams I didn't recognize. Human bodies modified with additional organs, nervous systems rewired for enhanced function. I've been perfecting techniques for human optimization for nearly 70 years, he said, extending life indefinitely, enhancing physical and mental capabilities, eliminating the weaknesses that plague natural human biology. The subjects you've seen are early successes, functional, obedient, immune to fatigue or injury. They're zombies, I said. They're improved, Dr. Voss corrected, free from the limitations of consciousness, emotion, fear, perfect workers for a perfect community. He stood and walked to a window overlooking the valley. I could make you one of them. The process is relatively painless now, and you would find peace in purposeful work without the burden of independent thought. Or you could join me as a colleague. Your documentation skills could be valuable for my research. Your knowledge of the outside world could help me identify new subjects for optimization. I stared at him, trying to process what he was offering. You want me to help you kidnap people? I want you to help me improve humanity, he said, one subject at a time. That night, they locked me in a comfortable room in the residential section of the complex. Through my window, I could see the optimized humans going about their work, maintaining the buildings, tending gardens that provided food for the community, carrying out research tasks in the laboratories. They never rested. They never spoke to each other. They worked with mechanical precision, like components in a vast machine, dedicated to Dr. Voss's vision of human improvement. I spent 3 days considering his offer, learning about the scope of his research, understanding the technology he'd developed. Some of it was genuinely impressive: life extension techniques, organ replacement procedures, neurological modifications that could eliminate mental illness or enhance intelligence. But it all required unwilling subjects. And it all resulted in the complete destruction of human consciousness. On the 4th day, I gave him my answer. I'll help, I said, but I want to understand the procedures first. I want to document the process properly. Dr. Voss was pleased. He gave me access to his research notes, showed me the surgical suites where the optimization procedures were performed, explained how he'd perfected techniques for maintaining human bodies indefinitely without consciousness or free will. What he didn't know was that I'd managed to hide a small recording device in my boot, and that I'd been documenting everything he showed me. On my 7th day in the valley, Dr. Voss brought in new subjects, a family of hikers who had been captured while camping in the national forest, parents and 2 teenage children scheduled for optimization the following morning. That night, while the community slept, I broke into the holding facility where they were being kept. Listen to me carefully, I whispered to the father. I'm going to get you out of here, but we have to move fast and quiet. I'd spent a week studying the security patterns, learning the routines of the optimized humans who served as guards. They were efficient but predictable, programmed for specific responses that could be anticipated and avoided. Getting the family out of the holding facility was relatively easy. Getting them out of the valley was harder. The optimized humans didn't sleep, and they could track movement through the forest with inhuman precision. We made it to the ridge before the hunting party caught up with us. This time, they weren't interested in taking me alive. Dr. Voss had apparently decided that I was too dangerous to keep around. The optimized humans pursued us with single-minded determination, moving through the darkness like predators. I fought them with everything I had, using weapons I'd taken from the facility's security office, but they were stronger and faster than normal humans, and they felt no pain. When I shot one of them, he kept coming until his body was too damaged to function. The family made it to my truck. I held off the pursuit long enough for them to reach the main road, but I didn't make it out myself. The optimized humans brought me back to Dr. Voss's facility, where he informed me that I would now serve as an unwilling subject for his research. "You've demonstrated that you cannot be trusted with advanced knowledge," he said, "but your body will serve the community well after optimization." They strapped me to one of the surgical tables I'd first seen in the stone building. Dr. Voss explained the procedure as he prepared his instruments: surgical removal of specific brain tissue to eliminate consciousness and free will, modification of the nervous system to enhance physical capabilities, installation of control mechanisms that would allow direct programming of behavior. "You'll find peace in purposeful work," he assured me as he made the first incision. But Dr. Voss had made one mistake. The family I'd helped escape reached authorities and provided them with coordinates to the valley. While he was beginning my optimization procedure, federal agents were surrounding the facility. The raid was massive and violent. Modern law enforcement with contemporary weapons against optimized humans who had been perfected for combat but were still using 1920s technology and tactics. The battle raged throughout the valley for hours. Dr. Voss tried to complete my surgery even as explosions shook the building, but the optimized humans defending the facility began falling back. When federal agents breached his surgical suite, he was forced to abandon the procedure. I was partially optimized. Part of my brain had been surgically modified. Some of my nervous system had been rewired. But the process was incomplete, leaving me suspended between human consciousness and optimized functionality. The federal agents evacuated me to a military medical facility where surgeons spent months trying to reverse what Dr. Voss had done. They succeeded partially. I retained my consciousness and free will, but my physical capabilities remained enhanced. I was stronger and faster than I should be. My senses were more acute, and I required very little sleep. Most disturbing, I could sense the presence of other optimized humans, like a frequency only we could hear, drawing us toward each other. Dr. Voss died during the raid, but many of his subjects escaped into the mountains. The federal government classified the entire incident, destroyed the research facility, and declared the valley permanently off-limits. Officially, none of it ever happened, but I know the optimized humans are still out there, still following their programming, still carrying out tasks Dr. Voss assigned to them decades ago. Sometimes I catch glimpses of them in remote areas of the mountains, moving through the forest with inhuman precision, maintaining hidden facilities, waiting for orders that will never come. And sometimes, late at night, when the surgical scars behind my ears start to itch, I can feel them calling to me, trying to activate whatever programming Dr. Voss managed to install before the raid interrupted my optimization. I left the Forest Service and moved to a city far from the mountains, but the enhanced hearing that Dr. Voss gave me means I can still hear them. The enhanced vision means I can still see them in crowds, recognizing the subtle signs of surgical modification, the mechanical precision of their movements. They're spreading, slowly, carefully, but spreading, building new facilities, capturing new subjects, continuing Dr. Voss's work without his direct supervision. And someday, when there are enough of them, they'll come for the rest of us, because Dr. Voss programmed them with one final directive: optimize all of humanity, one subject at a time. The family I saved testified that there are dozens of hidden facilities throughout the Appalachian Mountains, places where forgotten communities conduct research that the outside world isn't ready to understand. The federal government knows about them but can't eliminate them all without massive public exposure, so they remain hidden, waiting, working, perfecting techniques that will eventually transform our entire species into something Dr. Voss would have considered improved. I know because sometimes when the programming tries to assert itself, I can see his vision. A world populated by optimized humans, stronger, faster, more durable than natural humans, but without consciousness or free will. perfect workers for a perfect society. And the most terrifying part is that sometimes, in my darkest moments, it doesn't seem like such a bad idea. The scars itch more frequently now. The programming grows stronger every month. I estimate I have maybe 2 years before Dr. Voss's final optimization completes itself and I become one of them permanently. When that happens, I'll return to the mountains. I'll find the hidden facilities and report to whatever optimized human has assumed command. I'll help them continue the work of improving humanity, one unwilling subject at a time, unless someone stops them first. The coordinates of the original facility were 36.22847 degree N, 81.6940 Al-Shri-W. The federal government will deny this information exists, but the valley is still there, still active, still recruiting new subjects for optimization. Don't go looking for it. Don't try to investigate. Don't make the same mistake I made, because the mountains are full of forgotten places where people are working to perfect humanity, and they're always looking for new volunteers.